is about partners and, well, no, not partners, the opposite. Upcoming potential APIs. And so what I thought might be useful for everyone in the room is to just run through this deck that I had lying around on some of the different potential APIs that we might invest in the future. These slides are a little old, so apologies if some of these are like just starting and have kind of started a little bit, like window placement is in here, even though that's far along. This is also by no means the complete list. We, of course, have the complete list in CR-bug, proj-fugu, or go/fugu-bugs, so check that out for the full list. As we're going through this list, if there's anything that really excites you on a personal level, definitely make sure to note it down and bring it up with your manager, because, of course, having someone who's passionate about building out an API is the very most important thing to its success. So if you see anything you like, write it down. And without further ado, I'm just going to start going through these. Raise your hand as I'm going through these. If you have a question on the API, I'll finish my sentence and then call on you. But without further ado, launch external apps with file. This is one that I described a little bit yesterday, but basically applications want to say, hey, I want to open this as another program, and then have Chrome actually mediate the user picking that program to open the file in. And another one that we've kind of, yes, please, question. Excellent, I love it. Woo.
Can you go into a little more detail about why this isn't just open with the default handler?
How do you mean open with the default handler?
Well, like if it's a .ps file open with Photoshop, why would there be a...
I think this could effectively be that integrated into a web API rather than into systems. Yeah, because we have the like open with feature, the file handling feature, which effectively does this just at an operating system level. This would be doing that same thing on a Chrome level so that I can hit a UI button in my actual web page to trigger the same kind of behavior. But yeah, maybe some opportunity for code sharing. Looking at you, whoever's doing file handling. Yeah, Sam.
So just to further get clarification here. So what happens today if you click on a file name that it's not known by the browser? If I understand correctly, it gets downloaded, right? So this API would be something that instead of downloading it, it would download and open?
I don't know yet. We haven't started looking at these APIs.
So maybe from a product perspective, can you walk us through the user journey?
I think the user journey, so whether or not we would do this as like the regular like file type kind of UI or code inside of a web page to trigger this, or whether or not this would be like an entirely new API that would be triggered from like a JavaScript.
No, I mean, this is the solution. I was wondering about the problem. Like, what is the user flow in which this happens?
Oh, okay. So the user flow is I'm working in one app, say an editor like Figma, and this is something that Figma supports in their Electron app, for example. And I am working on a design, and maybe I want to convert it to a different format. Maybe I want to edit it in some other program. Let's say I want to open it in Photoshop. There's a very common use case for Figma designers. They want to, without having to, so the web app way to do this today, do we have someone joining?
He's setting up the...
Oh, okay, cool. So the way that this has to be done today, if you're a web app, is you have to go and download one version of the file, and then actually go into your native OS and then open that file with Photoshop. To shorten that path, what Figma really wants to do is just a button in their UI, they click it, and then a picker comes up that lists out all of the applications on your operating system that support that file type, and then you pick it, and then Chrome effectively launches that application opening that specific file. Okay. We are doing some settings. Live captions, nice. All right, I will keep stopping at the end of each of these. I love these questions. We want to talk through these things with you, so keep them coming. So this is another one that we've talked about a little bit in the past, app icon menus. This is obviously something that native applications can do today, and we want to enable the same thing. This reaches across both desktop and mobile. Very similar to this API, could even be kind of the same implementation you could imagine, but specifically the system menu bar that you, for example, have along the top bar of Mac. This is, again, an extremely popular Electron feature. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Again, this was a deck that was not necessarily meant for presentation style, but rather asynchronous consumption.
Yeah.
trying to figure out. So that this is like the on a Mac. So this is the top thing on a Mac, right?
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
controlling the menu items on the Mac itself.
Yep.
And so that would be if I launched. Okay, so this is the title bar. So if I launch a PWA across the top of the PWA in Windows, the title bar is not. It could be in at least Chromium's implementation of PWAs on Mac today. You have, of course, still the top bar because you have that for every application. But then there is also separate UI across the actual window of the screen. And you could imagine one application that had multiple windows but would still only have the same top menu bar.
And Windows, what would this look like?
I don't necessarily know. Again,
What did you say?
Yeah.
Wait, too many people talking. I just want to hear one person talk. It is that top bar. Mm-hmm. Okay, and you have complete customization of that? Okay. So I understand now. So in Windows, this would be, if you launch the PWA, instead of having just like a back button or whatever across the top of a PWA, you'd actually be able to control all the menus that show up across the top of the PWA.
I do have another slide in this deck that speaks a little bit more specifically to that functionality, but I could easily see it being implemented in the same way.
Okay.
So is the idea for this one that even if your PWA is not in focus, that the...
No, I think it would lean into the existing Mac UI pattern, which is whatever window and application is focused has that main top bar set.
Yeah, I think for Windows, that's then just the window menu on the app.
Yeah.
There's a series of challenges here. There's a series of challenges here about like how these are all actions, right? These are all actions you can take that are contextual. So the user has the application, it's launched, they can do things with the application, and then we want to provide sort of a uniform way or style of both exposing what those things are that you can do, and we'll need to provide some per OS customization. My guess is this is the default for Mac, but there will be other ways of doing it for Windows, and we should talk about what those are. But these actions are actually relatively generic, and so if you think about how do I do contextual copy paste, right? Like that's the easy one, but there's lots of other actions, right? And so menu systems are one expression of those actions, but developers today on the web don't have a way of thinking about those actions as actions. They have to cobble together a bunch of keyboard event handlers and then touch handlers and then a bunch of other things. We don't have a uniform system for that. So you can see that expressed as how would I expose, for instance, the set of assistive actions that I would be able to take in context in an application to something that's a voice assistant. This is the legacy UI for actions, but you can imagine lots of different entry points into them. And so one of the ways that I've been at least thinking about this is, what if we could express the actions outward and then configure how they would show up in these sorts of menuing and jump list and other sorts of activity systems. I'd love to talk more about that at a breakout if anyone's got time.
Yep. I think this kind of design and designing any of these APIs, I think would be a great option for a breakout session.
Does it include the regular system shortcuts, like on Windows F1 to bring up the help menu?
Join the breakout session.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I just fully upfront, I'm not going to have a lot of answers necessarily. I can give you my own opinions, but these are by design the APIs that we haven't really designed yet, which also means that it's a real field opportunity for all of us to get together and actually have a conversation about how these should work without anything being set in stone. All right. I'm loving all the questions. Please do keep them coming. The next one to talk about, I'm too short for this thing. Or yeah, this thing is too short. The next thing to talk about is enterprise management. This has kind of, at least to my mind, a few different potentials. One that we've already done on Chrome is the ability to force install PWAs and actually just regular websites so that admins can kind of push software to their managed devices. And then secondarily, I think this is an opportunity for us to actually bypass some of the potential permissions. The model for Chrome, excellent, thank you. The model for Chrome admins today is that they are fully trusted and fully knowledgeable, like the admin just owns the entire system. And so they can actually make intelligent, educated decisions, something that our users often struggle with about these things. And so for origins where we maybe want to not show a permission prompt or even expand the capabilities of some of these specific APIs, this is a real potential way to do that. We're currently looking at this for enabling raw sockets access, for example, without the kind of scary prompt that we might have to otherwise show. Any questions? Device memory and memory pressure event. I mentioned in a previous day that one of our partners did the thing where they wanted to use the maximum memory available, so they just kept allocating memory until it caused a memory crash, and then they would record that number and just try not to exceed it in the future. That's obviously not a great user experience, but what they really want to know is, I want to take up all the memory that I can. This is, again, applications that are really pushing the boundaries, including VMs and kind of virtualization software, where they can kind of expect to be one of the only things running on the machine at that time and really need that maximum RAM. Because who wouldn't want Chrome to use more RAM, right? Oh boy, can it. You ain't seen nothing.
Just a plug for this one, the Web Performance Working Group has discussed the memory pressure event and seems to have cross-browser consensus that, hey, this would be a cool thing, and the current design of it looks good. This is really just waiting on implementation.
Yeah, I believe Ulan out of the V8 team is working on this.
Also, we did, in fact, do an experiment where we made Chrome use more memory. It was called the Memory Ablation Study, and it showed that, surprise, users don't use the web as much when the browser uses more memory.
Yeah.
Users do not use the web as much when the browser uses more memory.
Or I guess the specific to the study, a user will spend less time on an origin, and their conversion metrics will be significantly worse when you increase the memory consumption of that site. Yeah. Surprise. Okay, so then other one that I've mentioned in the past is the kind of bring to front interrupting notification. This is again a native capability that they have, and is especially useful for video calls or other things where you really want to be like alerted. You could also imagine like a cooking timer or anything else. This is a very common permission on Android and relatively common on desktop as well. You could imagine this building on top of the notification system and maybe intersecting with like the windowing API somehow. Then is native sockets, which we're now starting to refer to more as raw sockets. This is, I think, primarily motivated by the fact that a lot of endpoints that developers want to connect to today aren't configurable. The mental model that I like to have is an IT admin at some college or enterprise where there's some old server sitting in the locked room and nobody's touched it in the last 10 years and nobody wants to open that box. But they do want to connect to it over Chrome. Citrix is one partner specifically that I mentioned yesterday who is highly motivated by this and want to enable this. And as I mentioned, I think enterprise controls are a great option for this. Right now, our best guess at a viable security model is actually a dialog with a text box asking you to type in the IP and port number that you would like to connect to. This is intentionally scary because raw sockets inherently break the same origin model, and that can be a real problem from a security perspective. File system provider, shout out to, Olivier, on the last one? Yeah.
Yes, on sockets. So you mentioned Citrix as a use case. It's a admin tool meant to manage other machines. Are there use cases where you would want a PWA to run in the background? Because you could imagine that this is useful to run some kind of server.
Yes, I think you should be able to do that through WebSockets or other socket-based solution like Web Transport, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But I think specific to this one, it's really just about connecting to non-configurable endpoints.
As a client?
Yes.
I would imagine a server would be kind of useful too. You know, you could, like, aside from WebSockets, especially if you want to interact with.
Do you mean a client trying to connect to a server or a server?
No, the server runs in the background.
Oh, I see. Riley has something. Yeah. Probably better answer than
yeah,
me.
so this is actually a use case that we've seen in the Chrome Sockets API. There's a TCP server API in the Chrome Apps platform, which we have seen people writing web servers and other servers that are allowed to run in the background, because you can also do that with the Chrome app. I don't think that is not a target for the initial version of the native sockets API for the web. And we are also trying to figure out an extension to WebRTC that would allow for offline peer-to-peer connections, which would satisfy some of that same server use case. But it's possible we could also support servers through native sockets in service workers someday. That's really far out there.
Yep, I think this is a great potential use case. At the end of this, I do plan to kind of do a polling of the room and maybe do some ideation on other potential APIs that we haven't really thought as much about. And way to start us off, Olivier, we now have server as one potential use case that we don't necessarily have support for. Okay, other questions? No. So continuing right along, file system provider, shout out to Daniel, who championed this idea a long time ago and made these beautiful sketches, A+ work. The basic idea here is to do something similar that we did to the payment provider API, which lets one website have an abstraction layer across different payment providers who can then sign up to be integrated. This would let you have, say, a button in an editor that says open file. You click on this, and then you get Chrome UI, where you can see, for example, your native file system, and then you can add additional new file system providers, things like Google Drive, Dropbox, OneDrive, et cetera. There's a billion of these now. And then at an abstract level, you as a user can manage these things, and it removes the need for the developer to actually integrate with all these different services. And Daniel, yes. Mike.
Yeah, I heard a lot about this. Awesome. I have a lot of thoughts about this. Some other cool things to think about is, why do people use Dropbox? Maybe they just wanted to get that ticket PDF on their phone. If Chrome is on your phone as well as your desktop, maybe you can just send the file to your phone. Another interesting thing to think about is maybe your fridge has all your recipes and you signed into Chrome on your fridge because, let's say that's a thing.
Somehow reality,
and the fridge the web app registered as a file system that accepts only .recipe files or whatever. And so you can just save your recipes to your fridge. I mean, this is assuming lots of things, but and then your fridge would be able to have file listeners on that. It could wake up to a thing being added, and then bam, your stuff's there. So there's a lot of cool opportunities when we think about customizing this.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I think one of the other things I really like about this API is that it makes it much easier for new entrants. In the past, you had to be a certain size of a file system provider in order for developers to bother integrating with you. But this can make it much easier for new entrants to come in. And I think that's part of what the web is all about.
Yeah, so this was kind of Daniel's idea. And I can see you have a couple things like partners that probably could use it, but have any of them actually expressed like a desire for it?
I can share that AutoCAD has expressed active interest in this. They actually proposed proactively, without us mentioning this API to them. They kind of mentioned this idea. This was a while ago, and I think the person actually has left AutoCAD by now. But yes, one partner at least did bring it up proactively.
Whole file systems are remote. You could also say, hey, upload YouTube from my Dropbox. You don't have to download that.
Yep. The comment was if both are remote, then you could still upload to YouTube.
Like remote file systems interact.
I see. So yeah, like you don't have to download to the client and then upload to a different server. You can have direct connection. Yep. Then you wouldn't have to necessarily use any of your own data. You could just use the server providers.
So we have this we had this in the Chrome Apps API for Chrome OS with the file system provider API. I was used in a couple of places. I think it had some design issues that made it not all that performant, but we can get it right this time. A question like for Chrome OS that made a lot of sense because the system really doesn't it has local storage, but it's not really designed to be used as like permanent local storage. You want to use Dropbox or Google Drive or OneDrive, something like that. How do we foresee this interacting on desktop? Most importantly, something that was never really even within Chrome, the file system provider API wasn't completely integrated. There were things you couldn't like save directly to a file system provider API. You had to save the downloads and then copy it to the file system provider. We would obviously fix that, but like, would we actually integrate with the operating system level file system pluggability infrastructure so that
I think even a V0 or V1 of this would absolutely have your native file system listed out here. I do think that there's a certain kind of critical mass aspect to this, where if I as a user only see this button on one application, then the value is relatively limited. I think the value really starts to increase when this is something that I can consistently do across many different websites and many different file editors and whatnot. And I think part of getting this API right is making sure that we have kind of upfront support from enough partners that this could attain that kind of critical mass.
So what I was concerned about was integration with native apps. If I have like the native version of Word installed and I double click and I'm on like Dropbox, I get a file like that's referenced through this from Dropbox, and I do the open intent that we were talking about in the previous idea. Like, do we actually provide the necessary shims so that the native application can read the file that comes from the file system provider API from the web?
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about that, but it's a great point. I could see us pursuing different weird paths, like potentially doing local syncing or somehow tying into each of these applications' own local syncing and making that a part of the API so that you actually have the files provided by the file system provider locally stored so that they could integrate well with native apps. That seems tricky. I mean, maybe we can build a Windows API for this too. I don't know. Maybe we should do a breakout session on it. Yeah. Vince is getting exercise today. Get those steps.
I don't know if it's worth diving into a lot. I did a good amount of research on what Dropbox, what these apps do to sync local files to the cloud, and it's truly terrifying.
Yeah, seems like it.
An example is the Windows API you're allowed to use to listen to file events isn't always in the right order. So you might get like a change after a delete or like a change, the file moving. We don't want to do that. But if we can avoid doing that, then that'd be great.
Yeah, I think definitely the thing that we need to do well before we pursue this kind of API is actually just fully land the native file system API and get broad adoption from the ecosystem. Once we have that, I think we can leverage off of that as a jumping board to potentially exploit this one.
And if anybody wants to think about this more, I like this area specifically around thinking about what are the use cases that we want to solve, not so much like, should we do a synchronized file system across device? Instead of thinking of that, I love thinking about what actually do people use that for? Because then I feel like you can end up being a lot more creative. And my hypothesis is that we don't need to do that because all of these cases that need that have much better ways of doing it. Like I don't need to save my movie ticket to synchronize to my device. I just want that on my phone.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Absolutely. I think last point from me is one of the things I like about this API is that you could argue that it's not necessarily like an inherently new capability because you could integrate with these different file system providers on your own in the past, and people obviously do. But I think this is one example of an opportunity for Chrome to act as a abstraction layer across different service providers and making sure that users can actually have a unified experience when they're using all of these different applications. So awesome work, Daniel. All right, touch bar, everyone's favorite example of will the web ever support blank? This one kind of comes up. It honestly comes up more often as an example of, well, the web can't support touch bars, so it'll never be good enough. I have yet to really hear too many partners who are super passionate about this one. Because who actually likes the touch bar here? Show of hands. No, anyone? But regardless, I think there are multiple ways that we've thought of in the past of how we could pursue this. You could maybe imagine it being integrated into like the actions thing that Alex was mentioning around menus. You could also imagine just modeling this as a canvas that you get to paint pixels to and create touch events on, or just another window as part of the window management API. All kinds of things that you could imagine for the design of this. I think the challenge would be making sure to do that in a way that abstracts across different platforms, since obviously no one has this thing yet. Alex, Vince, no, comment here first. No? Imagined hand.
if anyone's curious about this topic, I would love to discuss more. Peter Beverlew and I have discussed approaches for other alternative surfaces, and I'm writing it up now, sort of leaning on the notifications style, where we might be able to represent things in a more constrained style. But the touch bar is unique in that it is a 60 frames a second, mostly surface with full touch capability. And so it's a bit of an outlier. So if we can sort of brainstorm other surfaces that we might want to address and their constraints and their potential benefits, I think that'd be great. Thanks.
Olivier.
I am wondering why we're even talking about this. Well, I'll qualify this. I have met people who love it, and I sort of questioned my relationship with them, but then I understood.
You should.
They are productivity users. They're what should we call it? People that use Photoshop, that kind of thing. So productivity suite users, and it turns out to be useful for them. It doesn't work for me, but which makes me think we don't have enough data to know if it's useful or not, and how do we get the data? Because we're not the right audience.
Our traditional method for prioritizing these API is looking at what Chrome apps are using, what do partners who want to come to the web want to have, and potentially kind of what does Electron offer. And this is definitely relatively high on the Electron list. But again, it's not super high on most partners lists, and I don't actually think that we'll end up investing in this in the short term.
What you just said implies that the issue here might also not be inherent to the device itself, but how it's currently used. And there might be a killer use case on the horizon that will just make it universal.
Yep, it's Alex.
Very quickly, there's that sort of rinky-dink model I outlined on Wednesday, where there's that space between things that are available on most devices, on most operating systems. This is on the bubble. If we squint, we could imagine sort of a uniform alternative surfaces API, like widgets on Android or live tiles on Windows, and this would be just another one of those. And so then it would definitely fall into that bucket. But if we treat it as a specific and separate API, I think we would say that it's not yet in that place. So there's a sort of a line question. Where are we going to draw the line? We can maybe consider it a generic alternative UI surface. In that case, we would provide something much more constrained than what developers quote unquote might be asking for, but we could revisit it later. So there's a way to set the line or consider it to sort of be in or out of scope.
Yep.
Gotcha. So that's sort of answers my follow-up to the question, which is, it seems to be based on popularity, the way we think about things. And maybe there are some features that are used by little people, but they really want it. And like this generic way could account for it. However, maybe they need really tight control on the thing to make it useful.
We do some amount of our own kind of like user studies and user explorations to understand what users want. In general, we lean quite heavily on developers and partners and trust that they're the ones who know best about what their application users actually want and need. And again, this hasn't been super high. If we ended up doing this, personally, I think it would just be so that we could squash the Chrome doesn't support the touch bar. Because that would be really nice. Moving right along, tabbed application mode for PWAs. This is for sites that want to be installable and kind of want that icon, and they want to be in their settings panels and all that stuff, but they actually kind of like the tabbed mode. They have multiple documents and are used to user patterns where users switch rapidly between different documents, and they would want to do that in a tab mode rather than actually as multiple different windows, which kind of makes sense. I will say that I don't know necessarily when we would start building this. This is not something we've actively started.
But if you're interested in contributing use cases or thinking about implementation, there are some of the folks from Sydney who are not here who are also doing some thinking about it. So we should hook you up.
Yep. Moving right along. This is the downloadable installer for PWA. This is basically allowing you to take your PWA and actually create something that I can download and then double click on to install it. This is obviously more clicks than if you just click the install button, but sometimes users want to do the thing that's familiar. Another big motivator for this API is for people who want to distribute the PWA, but their users aren't necessarily using Chrome. You could potentially imagine this including some like basic, or Edge, yes, exactly. Chromium, I should say. You could imagine actually shipping like a minimum bootstrap system for Chrome that would actually like let Chrome be installed in some way. That has all kinds of implications for obvious reasons, but it's also kind of what Electron does for every application today. So hey, funny story. Some devs actually also just want to do this because they feel like if they host something on the web, there is an expectation that if users pay for it, that'll continue to be maintained and kind of updated. Personally, my sister made an Electron app because she wanted to package something, throw it over the fence, and then have people kind of pay $5 to download it. But she didn't want to continue to host it or manage it or provide continual updates or bug fixes or things like that. And so she kind of liked that she could just have something packaged and throw over. And yes, I gave her a lot of crap for using Electron. Question? Yes.
One use case I've heard from Africa is that the mobile data can be hugely expensive, so people just want to Bluetooth their package over. So
I think Alex is about to mention web packaging.
Yeah. Okay. So that is your fix.
Alex, I spent too much time with you.
All right.
Yeah. I think web packaging is one idea of how we could approach this. And specifically, there are things you could imagine doing around web packaging and TWAs and whether or not you can bundle these things together. And Alex wants to say something. So. Yeah, find Alex later if you're interested in web packaging. He will talk your ear off. In a good way, yeah, obviously. Come on. Any other questions on this one? Cool. Window placement and screen manipulation. This is one of those I mentioned that's in here because this deck is kind of old, but we're already doing this one. Yay. This is the ability to tell the number of screens, detect the resolution size, and then also get information, or rather get the ability to actually locate position windows on those screens. This is extremely useful for things like slides where you're like presenting and you maybe have like your speaker notes. It's also very useful for virtualization software where you want to take up kind of the full real estate and potentially move windows. And lastly, we've also heard this as a request from a lot of financial trading software, things like OpenFin. Then there is the run on startup. This would almost certainly be restricted to desktop PWAs because it doesn't necessarily make sense in tabbed mode. This could work either at the startup time of Chrome, and then assuming that Chrome started up at the start of your machine, it would be effectively the same thing. Or Edge, sorry, I apologize. A startup of Chromium, which could kind of make this two different capabilities. You could imagine this either showing up at install time when you have the little pop-down prompt. You could have a little checkbox that says like run on startup. You could also imagine supporting this by right-clicking on the actual icon in the dock and saying, run on startup. This is the Mac behavior today, for example. And yeah, questions? And then Access Codex. This is officially now named Web Codex, and this is going to be worked on by Peter Thatcher. If any of you know him, he'll be at TPAC, as well as Mike West and team out of the Munich office are officially picking this up. There will be lots of discussion at TPAC about this specific API. I guess I should describe it. It's the ability to actually access some of the many built-in codecs that are actually shipped with Chrome. This includes both software and hardware decoders. And if any of you know about like WebAssembly and SIMD, hopefully when we have the full set of SIMD, we should be fairly close to parity with software codecs. But even then, there are still hardware codecs that we want to make sure that developers can get access to for all their encoding and decoding needs. Questions? Yes.
Any list of initial set of codecs you're already planning?
We do, and it's linked in the bug that is in CRBug. They have an explainer with some of the initial things. There were some questions around whether or not, we know that we definitely want to do audio and video. There are some active questions around whether or not we want to do image coding and decoding, since that's largely performant enough through WebAssembly today, especially with SIMD, even the initial set. And then there's also a separate API for compression codecs, which I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but is being done outside the scope of this specific API. But that compression stream, exactly. So I think they might have actually upped this to 8 gigabytes recently, I heard from somebody, but V8 basically has this limit. I believe it's still 4 gigabytes for the actual like stack that V8 has, but typed arrays exist kind of outside of that limit, and I think that's the limit that was just raised to 8. But basically, as applications become more and more demanding, and as the expectation becomes that your application is the one thing that is being used on your computer right now, the idea is that we shouldn't limit your application to actually only a small subset of the available RAM, but be able to actually give them, you know, the full amount of RAM. And yes, this is going to make Chrome use more RAM. Right. Or Edge. God damn. I need a swear jar, but like a jar that I have to put $1 in or 100 yen every time. Or Brave, or Opera, or Samsung browser. Or Safari, yeah. 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 The browser. There you go. Better printing. Today, the default is for printing that it just kind of prints what's in the DOM. This can lead to all kinds of weird things, especially for applications that have kind of just a single canvas element that they dynamically render to, because then when you hit print, you're just printing the one thing that you're looking at right now, and that's really confusing to users. I don't think we've done a ton of API design around this yet, but definitely one possibility is that you just let, you just give information about the size that you're printing to, and then you just let them push a bunch of pixels. I know, mics. I'm sorry for monopolizing this one, but my back thanks you, so I don't have to hunch over.
Too old to stand up. I shouldn't have stood up. So how is this different from just using media queries for printing?
I think Josh can answer that one.
Yeah, so this is kind of an intentionally vague description. There are parts that are already being tackled, and there's parts that we think should be tackled in the future, but we don't have any engineering effort assigned to them. So some work has actually already been done to address some needs here. For example, canvas printing is now high resolution. Even if you render your content to a canvas at screen resolution, if you go to print the page, we've got the SCIA commands recorded so that when we generate the PDF, it's print quality. So that's one request that's already been handled. A piece that's being designed out of our printing team in LA is very hand-wavy, but the ability for sites to provide more print settings and read back what the user chooses in Chrome's print settings. Very, very hand-wavy, and that team actually doesn't have much experience in designing web platform APIs, so they're probably gonna have lots of requests and go down some blind alleys there. That's one piece of it. If you actually use some of the G Suite apps, when you go to print, you'll see G Suite will have its print settings, then you get jumped into Chrome's print settings, and who knows if those are unified with the system print settings. So that's one piece. But there's a handful of additional things. Page orientation is one where, per page print orientation is one that can be tackled through just implementing some CSS elements. But there are differing page sizes, not just orientations, and even things such as, should we just let pages generate PDF directly and then have access to that PDF? Just kind of outside the bounds of printing, but it would go through our same printing code. That's been a request. Examples of, I'll leave it at that. There's a handful of other requests. But we'd love to hear more use cases around printing. But yeah, this needs to be exploded out into a handful of separate capabilities. It's not just one thing.
Cool. Next up is full keyboard control. This is especially, so this is the ability for you as a website to actually listen to and control every single keyboard event. These would include things like Control Tab and the escape key, even if you're in full screen mode. And that sounds really scary because it allows you as a developer to potentially like trap your users inside of a certain experience, which is obviously bad. At the same time, it is a very reasonable thing for VM and virtualization software to actually want, because again, they're really actually trying to be a full application platform themselves. This is, again, the funny thing where they as an application platform sits on top of Chrome, which is an application platform, which sits on top of the OS, which is an application platform. Browser, god damn. Questions on this one? Yes, Olivier.
So thankfully in Chrome, we have the the remote desktop applications. Are there some learnings that we can get? I think also some virtualization software allow you to have an escape key cord or something. So you relinquish control.
I haven't used that too much, but again, like I think part of the problem would be that they would want that escape key themselves and be able to control the behavior of it. Yeah.
A lot of the, so there actually has been a lot of progress on this in the last 2 years. So there's actually very few things left that we need to cover. And the escape, I think, is a long press now.
I think enterprise control settings are also a really potentially great way to enable this.
And according to the desktop PWA folks, for desktop PWAs running standalone, this should already be supported.
Yeah. I think there's still some keys that they still capture, but yeah. Moving right along, full control of the top UI. Many Electron applications today actually just hide the top UI and then build in their own UI. This is partly to get things like the search box or like your little avatar and whatnot. This is obviously that's something that Chrome makes heavy use of ourselves to create the tab UI. It's a pretty reasonable thing for developers to want, but so far the main struggle has been being able to provide this in a way that, again, doesn't let malicious actors trap users into a certain experience. This obviously includes both the exit button and making sure that that exists, but also critically right now, one of the security requirements for desktop PWAs is that we at the very least briefly show the origin. And right now, we wouldn't be able to do that because this API would effectively remove all Chrome-controlled UI from the experience. Yeah.
Same thing with indicators, right?
Same thing with indicators, yeah.
So yeah, we've heard this. This is why I was trying to get clarity on the earlier slide to see, because I don't understand how Macs work, but we have big productivity suite partnerships at Microsoft that would really like to do this, in addition to potentially having it sort of disappear and then as you mouse over, reappear. Exactly. And I think it was yesterday or so we submitted an intent to implement media controls or media queries for like the back button and navigation, so you could tell if the developer was actually already doing this. I mean, if your UI has a back button showing, as a developer, you want to know that you don't need to show a back button inside of your own UI.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing.
Any Arc++ users out there know the pain of this?
Anyone remembers Winamp 3, where essentially instead of having a rectangular window, you could just have a round, whatever, circle window? Does this include this kind of UI request, or is it purely about about the top bar?
Yeah, so a little more nuance on that. Very good question. I was actually talking with a partner on, I'm going to say last Thursday, that was saying, yes, we want full control. We want that Winamp windowing type control. It was really good to be talking with them and drill into the use case, which is they actually wanted that, I think, for similar cases to the productivity apps where they're showing a palette, they're showing a pop-up, and those are elements that you can build within your window, but they get clipped using HTML, CSS, et cetera. But what if we gave them a primitive that let them, little palette that extends slightly outside the window, just like you have with HTML select elements? And they're like, yeah, that would probably address most of our needs. So not giving them full-blown Winamp, can't even tell this is a browser window, but a more limited capability might address 90% of the use cases.
Yeah, so one of the other things to think about as we introduce like multi-windowed applications is that there may be differences of what you want on your main window versus other child windows. Like if you have a modal where you have to accept or decline, you don't necessarily need the X and caption control stuff, or, like the amount of customization for non-top level windows gets also very, very complicated very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think OpenFin was another interesting example of this that kind of speaks to that exact point, where they have like 50 trading windows across 10 screens, because apparently that's how traders do things. But you can imagine if you have like 50 pixels of every single one of those windows controlled by Chrome and just like a blank color, that's
Yeah, and like to add to that, on the topic of financial apps, usually like they even fight with Windows on trying to get our like native custom title bars to shrink by a few pixels, because literally every single pixel to them is a huge deal.
Exactly. All right, last API that we are planning to potentially add to the browser someday. This idea would be that in Chromium, you could access API functionality through the browser to get scanning functionality, and in Chromium, you could then actually have an API to read from the scanner and get that information into Chromium. Riley just mentioned this to me, and I didn't have a slide on it, so I added one. The end. Yes.
Question, Riley, why is that not just a generalized API for accessing a device driver?
Is the answer reasons?
Hilarious raisins. No, so I mean for the same reason that we have things like the Gamepad API instead of just everybody using WebUSB, operating systems have rather mature APIs for accessing scanners, and scanners have drivers that are built to those APIs. And so this would be, again, sort of meeting the operating system where it is in terms of exposing. It's the opposite of the printing API, right? Like we have this thing for printing where you take a DOM and you put it on paper, and this is basically similar to like image capture. So like Miguel did a lot of work on image capture, but that was very much focused on cameras, and this would be the same kind of set of functionality but focused on the flat document scanning.
All right.
Just I want to comment, this is actually one of the APIs that's exposed in the Chrome Apps API surface. So we already have code for this in the Chromium code base. So
who doesn't love migrating code that you didn't write?
But usage is fairly low, so did not hit our initial prioritization. So if you hear use cases for this, you hear partners, it's like, this should be easy, right?
So this was the last API that I have a slide for. Again, the list of CR bugs, I think this was like 20, 30 something APIs that I just went through. I think CR bug has like 84 at last count. So by no means the complete list, and please go check out CR bug. I was planning to run a little session where we could just ideate together on the different APIs. I'm going to pretend that was never part of the plan because I timed this perfectly otherwise. This session is supposed to end at 11:45, and we're going to lunch for an hour and 15 minutes. If people feel passionate about doing the ideation session, I'm happy to go 15 minutes into lunch as one option, or we can do it as a breakout session, or not at all. Come talk to me anytime you want. Any strong opinions? Lunch it is. I heard it first. Yes, you can leave your bags here. This area is only available or accessible to Googlers and visitors, obviously, but also feel free to bring it.
There's also a phone back here that's on the floor that's now on.
Nice. All right. Thanks, everyone. I don't know.
Yes. What's one idea? Let's have us here for the most no, like, okay, so we're very yeah, it was a correct like basically the summary is it's in process, right? So you have some business systems that are scanning a document so we had that not with external scanner scanner the application and uploading it being able to trigger the system scanner from the website the same way to trigger printing.
Um,